Hello and thank you for tuning into the Federalist Files. We're going to be going over Federalist number 59 today. Actually, no, not 59. It should be 60. So we're going to be going over Federalist number 60 today. It is titled "The Same Subject Continued Concerning the Power of Congress to Regulate the Election of Members," written by Alexander Hamilton, February 23rd, 1788. Topics include objections of favored class taking over government, no provision giving such privileges to a particular class, government power is derived from the people, and that's kind of how this one ends. This one, he deep dives into the exact same elements of the very last paper that we just recently went over. The objectors to the Constitution, their objection to this provision, I think it was Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, Clause 1. It was the Elections Clause, and that was their objection, was that the federal government had some sort of power over the time, manner, and place of federal elections in terms of the House of Representatives for reasons of self-preservation, which we went over in the last one. So he continues that same exact subject, but he's answering different objections. The objections this time in this particular paper are going to be that there is going to be a favored class of men, mostly from money, people that are wealthier, and they're going to take advantage and create some sort of oligarchical or aristocracy. So in this paper, Hamilton answers contentions of his last paper: the federal government regulation of elections can give a favored class of men power by excluding all others. So he starts off, he states, and I quote, "We have seen that an uncontrollable power over the elections to the federal government could not, without hazard, be committed to the state legislatures. Let us now see what would be the danger on the other side, that is, from confiding the ultimate right of regulating its own elections to the Union itself. It is not pretended that this right would ever be used for the exclusion of any state from its share in the representation. The interest of all would, in this respect at least, be the security of all." End quote. So here, just once again, he's saying the last paper we went over, the state legislatures should not have the complete and total power, because then they can completely shut down the elections if they wanted to, and that would kill the House of Representatives, and even in the Senate per se, but the Senate is kind of much more representative of the state legislatures themselves, so the state government would not be opposed to having senators, but maybe if they were opposed to having House members, or they wanted to keep the same House members, then they can attempt to circumvent the process of election. And that's the reason, that is the only reason that there's some sort of exclusive power to the federal government in quote-unquote like the regulations of elections. And Hamilton stated in the last paper that that is in a last case contingency-like scenario. So he goes on, he states next, and I quote, "But it is alleged that it might be employed in such a manner as to promote the election of some favorite class of men in exclusion of others, by confining the places of election to particular districts and rendering it impracticable to the citizens at large to partake in the choice. Of all chimerical suppositions, this seems to be the most chimerical. On the one hand, no rational calculation of probabilities would lead us to imagine that the disposition which a conduct so violent and extraordinary would imply could ever find its way into the national councils. And on the other, it may be concluded with certainty that if so improper a spirit should ever gain admittance into them, it would display itself in a form altogether different and far more decisive." End quote. So what he says is you can have this system, this disenfranchisement from a state government, where they can just choose to have these confined places for elections. And I stated this example before. In a state like New Jersey, you can decide to have all of the elections take place outside of the big cities, and you can have mostly Republican votes, because then the big people that live in the big cities are not going to go, and because it's such a far distance for them, they're not going to go, and they're not going to go and vote. Let's say in a town that's 2 towns over from them, because that's where they're holding the nearest election. Thus, you would have a lot more Republican turnout for the election. You have a lot less Democrat, considering that usually the inner cities are heavily Democrat influenced. So that is a safeguard. The point of having this provision in the Constitution, it's supposed to work as a safeguard against some sort of a disenfranchisement. And additionally, he says if this were to happen, there would be a if this was the spirit of the national councils, it would be concluded with certainty that this improper spirit would not be able to gain admittance into like the regular national discourse. Pretty much the people themselves would not allow something like this to happen. So Hamilton, he responds that if this were the case, if an improper spirit should ever gain admittance into the National Council, it would be decisive. As in, it would be very obvious and the people would do something to change it. So furthermore, he states, and I quote, "The improbability of the attempt may be satisfactorily inferred from the single reflection that it could never be made without causing an immediate revolt of the great body of the people, headed and directed by the state governments. It is not difficult to conceive that the characteristic right of freedom may, in certain turbulent and factious seasons, be violated in respect to a particular class of citizen by a victorious and overbearing majority, but that so fundamental a privilege in a country so situated and enlightened should be invaded to the prejudice of the great mass of the people by the deliberate policy of the government without occasioning a popular revolt is altogether inconceivable and incredible." End quote. So he's saying the position that you have a government, a federal government, as well as a state government, usurp their power in a way where they're disenfranchising other peoples and they're making it more difficult, or they're taking away the suffrage, the voting rights of specific citizens or specific types of citizens, classes of citizens, aimed towards a particular class of citizens. He said there would be a revolt from the people and a rebellion as well. So Hamilton, and I mean at this time, you had Black Americans were unable to vote, and then, but they were counted. The whole 3/5 a vote, they were counted in terms of their representatives, but I'm pretty sure they did not have a right to suffrage at that time. That was later gained. Currently we have the Democrats come out and they do their kind of positioning about disenfranchisement because historically it was a thing, like 200 years ago, and they kind of continued to do that political positioning now where they try to relate what in modern times is going on to something that was happening 200 years ago, or nearly 200, 150 to 200 years ago. So he goes on. Hamilton claims that this would result in the rebellion of the great mass of people, points out that the idea of a favored class of men holding power is erroneous. He states, and I quote, "There is sufficient diversity in the state of property, in the genius, manners, and habits of the people of the different parts of the Union, to occasion a material diversity of disposition in their representatives towards the different ranks and conditions of society." End quote. So he's saying the government will be very diverse. It will be made up, and not diverse in terms of, because now when we talk about diversity in modern language, we pretty much mean diversity of ethnicity or race. We're talking about diversity of genius, manners of people, habits of people. So you'll have fishermen, you will have the merchant class, you will have blacksmiths, you will have people from all different beings, from all different cultures, backgrounds, and we don't, in this country now, the way that we look at diversity is, we don't look at it diversity of thought or diversity of opinion or ideology. We just look straight diversity, usually of race. The only other diversity that we will use to separate or divide people will be diversity of ethnicity, not ethnicity, political affiliation. So you'll have people that chill out for whatever their race or their nationality is, and then you'll notice that above that actually sometimes comes to politics. So if you notice that person is on the right wing, for example, just recently Jorge Masvidal, he lost his fight last night. Jorge Masvidal endorsed Donald Trump. He's on the right. He's Cuban American, so he understands the failings of socialism, communism. So he's spoken out against that very strongly. So the left, even if they're Hispanic left on the left, people that are Cuban, and I don't really know many Cubans that are on the left, but people that are from the, I guess, Hispanic nationality, they usually will shill out depending on their race. People that are known for doing that, and they're all around. There's so many different races where they'll shill only for their race specifically because that's all they care about, because that's all they've been taught to do by the corporate media and their education system. They're so used to shilling for their race and their nationality, but you'll notice at the end of the day, they will not actually shill. The politics comes before anything else in their head. So if they see Jorge Masvidal lose a fight, they're very excited and they're extremely happy about it, and they talk a bunch of smack about this dude losing a fight. And it's very weird because that's a kind of sport where you're really so individual. And when I watch, I'm a fan personally of MMA, mixed martial arts, UFC, Bellator, used to be Strikeforce. I'll watch it myself, and I'm never really happy to see anyone lose because the fight can be so detrimental to your health. It's just not. It's such a single influence, independent like sport, that when you lose mentally, it must be a serious struggle. And on top of that, the next morning you have to wake up and you're bruised and beaten down. And then you have regular people that have never actually experienced a struggle like that go into their real life, and they go on their social media and then they just yell out and they scream out and they're elated that you lost and you're beaten up and you're beaten down. And at the end of the day, this is what the left thinks of the right. They're happy. They're happy if you get killed. I mean, Ashley Babbitt, they weren't even satiated by her getting shot and killed. They were happy about it. They were excited. They were elated. They were enthusiastic. And it's the same exact way when it comes to anyone that is on the political right, the left, just demeans them consistently, and it's not dependent on. I think more than anything, the biggest ideology actually has to do with whether you're on the right or the left. It doesn't even really have to do as much on race. I would say race is probably number 2 on the intersectionality scale, the thing that divides the country the most. I actually think political ideology divides much more than race does at this point. And you see it with Candace Owens. Candace Owens gets called all these derogatory names from people that are ethnically the same as her. And it's because of her political ideology. It has nothing to do with her race. So, to go on here, just to state our government's going to be made up of a very diverse set of people, and it's not going to be diverse in terms of ethnicity. That's not at this time. This is not what people talked about and worried about now. In today's day and age, they think it's more important to look like somebody else than actually have the same thoughts and the same opinions and the same ideology. So, concluding that the Union will be comprised of many diverse individuals with different viewpoints from different parts of the country, the dissimilar modes of election from different branches will work as another safeguard against a predilection of duties and assure diversity. That's pretty much what he's saying. So he goes on, he states next, and I quote, "And though an intimate intercourse under the same government will promote a gradual assimilation in some of these respects, yet there are causes as well, physical as moral, which may, in a greater or less degree, permanently nourish different propensities and inclinations in this respect. But the circumstance which will be likely to have the greatest influence in the matter will be the dissimilar modes of constituting the several component parts of the government. The House of Representatives being to be elected immediately by the people, the Senate by the state legislatures, the President by electors chosen for that purpose by the people, there would be little probability of a common interest to cement these different branches in a predilection for any particular class of electors," end quote. So he's saying the people, the mode in which we elect our representatives in the government, they're all going to come from such a diverse, such a different background, every single individual, because this is the way that the founders, they found the country, the way in which they framed the Constitution, and the way that their whole world, their thought process is everybody is an individual. We don't think in this groupthink ideology like currently goes on the far left. We think of everybody as an individual, so every single individual isn't going to gang up in a group and get together and become some sort of majority and spike down on the minority. That's not what's going to happen. What we're going to have is we're going to have people from all different walks of life, with all different types of ideology and thoughts, and they're going to speak and they're going to think like individuals. Thus, this isn't practical for something like this to happen, for attempt at a disenfranchisement. So he goes on, he states, and I quote, "As to the Senate, it is impossible that any regulation of time and manner, which is all that is proposed to be submitted to the national government in respect to that body, can affect the spirit which will direct the choices of its members. The collective sense of the state legislatures can never be influenced by extraneous circumstances of that sort, a consideration which alone ought to satisfy us that the discrimination apprehended would never be attempted," end quote. So he's saying in the state legislatures, there's not going to be a discrimination in terms of voting for the Senate, because any time and manner, being proposed would not really submit to the national government some sort of disenfranchisement. And the reason is the state legislature, their representation in the federal government is the Senate. So the Senate is a direct representation of the state legislature. So for them to decide to mess around with any of the voting measures and the way in which elections are ran would really just disenfranchise them. So it'd be like shooting yourself in the foot. So that's why the Constitution doesn't really lay that out specifically, but much more does with the House of Representatives. So Hamilton, next he rhetorically asks who this favored class will be, whether it is that of a mercantile class or a manufacturing interest departments of industry, or is that of who adversaries most often cite, the wealthy and the well-born? Is that who these adversaries are talking about? Now, Hamilton believed that the National Council would consist of merchants and landowners, but neither will gain an ascendant amount of power in the national or local councils, considering they are dependent on one another, which is very important. So when he says landowners, merchants, he talks about manufacturers. These people all kind of work, they commingle their jobs together, they're all reliant on each other, they're all dependent on each other. So he thinks that they should easily be able to kind of work together once they get to the government. So next he states, and I quote, "If this partiality is to be exerted in favor of those who are concerned in any particular description of industry or property, I presume it will be readily admitted that the competition for it will lie between landed men and merchants, and I scruple not to affirm that it is infinitely less likely that either of them should gain an ascendant in the national councils than that the one or the other of them should predominate in all the local councils. The inference will be that a conduct tending to give an undue preference to either is much less to be dreaded from the former than from the latter." End quote. So it's just saying you're not going to have one that dominates over the other, the merchants and the landowners. And then he also kind of goes on to explain that there is no standard for the House of Representatives or the Senate. You don't have to be a landowner. You don't have to. None of those rules actually apply. So his adversaries, his political adversaries, saying that this is going to be somehow a rich and connected class is just not true, in essence. And just to compare what's going on today, generally a lot of our politicians are lawyers. They're not really from the working class, which is it is pretty unfortunate. Like Ted Cruz, lawyer, Tom Cotton, lawyer, Josh Hawley, lawyer, Elizabeth Warren, lawyer. A lot of them really come from that law background. I think it has something to do with lawmaking, maybe. And they're much more prominent. They kind of have a name behind them. They have more money. So comparatively, what our framers thought it was going to be, they didn't say anything about lawyers throughout these papers. They generally talked about normal people, merchants, farmers, blacksmiths, what have you, manufacturers, things of that nature. So he goes on, he states next, and I quote, "The several states are in various degrees addicted to agriculture and commerce. In most, if not all of them, agriculture is predominant. In a few of them, however, commerce nearly divides its empire, and in most of them has a considerable share of influence. In proportion as either prevails, it will be conveyed into the national representation. And for the very reason that this will be an emanation from a greater variety of interests, and in much more various proportions than are to be found in any single state, it will be much less apt to espouse either of them with a decided partiality than the representation of any single state." End quote. So we're saying since everything is kind of interconnected, intertwined, you have agriculture, you have commerce, and everybody works with each other. So if you hurt one person, then you're hurting yourself because the economy is so interconnected. Now what we have currently, we have a couple very big businesses that generally control the entire system. They control the entire thing. If those big businesses want to shut your company down, really they can. AWS, you had Amazon Web Services shut down Parler. Google, Apple as well. They all concerted to shut down Parler. Parler is now back up, but because they're following by what Apple is telling them to do. They have this weird little system now. When people go to report something, they have to go through this board or what have you. The internet, I remember, was probably, if I had to sit here and put my thumb on the scale here, the best time it was is probably around the very beginning of when the very inception of Facebook, maybe around 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, when there still was not this very strong authoritarian, totalitarian push coming from the mainstream left. Rather, you could just really say whatever you wanted. You could really, truly speak freely on these platforms, and now they're no longer platforms. They're kind of becoming much more publishers. So he goes on here. I don't know if I stated this one. He states next, and I quote, "In a country consisting chiefly of the cultivators of land, where the rules of an equal representation obtain, the land interest must, upon the whole, preponderate in the government. As long as this interest prevails in most of the state legislatures, so long it must maintain a correspondent superiority in the National Senate, which will generally be a faithful copy of the majorities of those assemblies. It cannot therefore be presumed that a sacrifice of the landed to the mercantile class will ever be a favorite object of this branch of the federal legislature." So he's kind of saying here, you're not going to have a bunch of people, the landed as in landowners, above the merchant class. You're not going to have a bunch of one more than the other. You're not going to have a preponderance of a huge majority against a small minority. You're not going to have a bunch of super rich connected comparatively to a bunch of like poor or working class, middle class. And that's kind of not really true today. I mean, at that time it was true. Today I think we have a lot of... When it comes to the House of Reps, that's a whole different story. But when it comes to the Senate, I think there are just a bunch of really rich, like connected people. If you look in the government, you look at Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi makes more money than anybody because she takes insider trading information in the government when they're going to make laws, and she goes and tells her son and her husband. They're huge investors. She's worth like $200 million. So we kind of have that set up currently in our system, unfortunately, from what it looks like. So to go on. In general, Hamilton states that the country chiefly consists of cultivators of land, and state assemblies will derive from these men, which is in turn will choose our senators as well. Therefore, the mercantile nature of the Senate, along with the general observation of the country. And here's what the problem is, folks. This is why it currently isn't like this, and I just stated this before. Because you don't have the state legislatures selecting who the Senate is. That's the problem. We have a direct democratic vote. And it was not like this before, and that's probably why he was making that assumption, is the state legislative branch, you think, okay, that is directly derived from the people themselves. So they're going to be they're going to be voting in the interests of that individual state. Whereas people in New Jersey, for example, are not educated on the issues. They don't really know what the state actually needs, so they're just voting with whatever party representation they like. They don't look at anything comprehensively, rather. So he goes on. He states next, and I quote, "I am governed by the consideration that the credulous votaries of state power cannot, upon their own principle, suspect the state legislatures would be warped from their duty by an external influence," end quote. So he's pretty much just saying the people that are in the state, they're not going to believe, they're not gullible, they're not going to somehow be influenced by the federal government, or an external influence is what he means. So the same goes for the federal House of Representatives. In summation, state councils and the people at large elect the federal government. The federal government serves as direct representatives of the people and act as such. Thus, this axiom does not render validity to the claim that the federal government has uncontrollable power over elections. In fact, it is antithetical. So Hamilton answers the contention that the federal administration will secure a monopoly for the landed class, as in the landowners. He answers, and I quote, "that men accustomed to investigate the sources of public prosperity upon a large scale must be too well convinced of the utility of commerce to be inclined to inflict upon it so deep a wound as would result from the entire exclusion of those who would best understand its interests from a share in the management of them," end quote. So you're going to have a bunch of the merchant class people that are involved in commerce that are going to have to run, and they're going to have to win these spots, because otherwise then it's antithetical to what they do for a living in the government. So if you have a government just filled with people that have no idea how business runs, which it's full of a lot of people that don't understand the way business runs, then you're going to have a very hard business environment. You're going to have high taxes. It's going to be very difficult for the business owner. Thus, you're going to have people from the merchant class, such as a Donald Trump, run for government. So to go on, In other words, commerce is the most effective safeguard against the corruption of the governing body because both the government and the people at large reap the benefits of a free and fair market. And that's the reason that I just stated. So to go on, and this is where he really attacks them on it here, where he goes, there's pretty much no provision that just gives the wealthy and the well-born positions in government. So he states, and I quote, I the rather consult brevity in discussing the probability of a preference founded upon a discrimination between the different kinds of industry and property, because as far as I understand the meaning of the objectors, they contemplate a discrimination of another kind. They appear to have in view as the objects of the preference with which they endeavor to alarm us, those whom they designate by the description of the wealthy and the well-born. These, it seems, are to be exalted to an odious preeminence over the rest of their fellow citizens. At one time, however, their elevation is to be a necessary consequence of the smallness of the representative body. At another time, it is to be effected by depriving the people at large of the opportunity of exercising their right of suffrage in the choice of that body. End quote. So he's saying in the times, when he says the times, at one time it was this way, one time it was this way, he's talking about in Europe, in Great Britain, you had the rich, wealthy, connected few. They're the ones that elected most of the government, and then the underclass elected a very small portion of the government, and they really weren't represented. That's all he's really talking about. And then I think that's when he's now going to attack it and go on to the way in which our government is to be run. So Hamilton, he concludes this paper by arguing against the designation of our government to be of the wealthy and the well-born. He states that there is no such provision that represents that discrimination and exclusion to government positions only for the wealthiest of citizens. So he states next in a quote, the truth is that there is no method of securing to the rich the preference apprehended, but by prescribing qualifications of property either for those who may elect or be elected. But this forms no part of power to be conferred upon the national government. Its authority would be expressly restricted to the regulation of the times, the places, the manner of elections. The qualification of the persons who may choose or be chosen, as has been remarked upon other occasions, are defined and fixed in the Constitution and are unalterable by the legislature. So what they're saying is, by giving the federal government some sort of power over the regulation of times, places, and manner of elections, in terms of the House of Representatives, a little bit with the Senate to an extent, the times and places, but the manner is the Senate. They can't do anything about it. On another note, what he's saying is, by giving the federal government that power, that does not mean that they can exclusively have the power also to change the qualifications of persons who may choose, as in who may vote, or who may be chosen, who may run. And that's really all that he's referring to there. And he says that is unalterable by the legislature. He means the federal legislature. Now, if you wanted to change and do some sort of amendment to the Constitution, you would need the federal, and that's why it says the legislature. You need the federal legislature, and then you would need every single state government legislature as well. You need 3/4 of them to vote on it as well. And that's the smartest. I think that may be one of the focal points of our government, of our Constitution, probably one of the most significant parts, is every single time you want to pass something that's against the Constitution, you want to amend the Constitution, you should have to go through the Congress, 2/3 a vote, and then you have to go through the state legislatures as well. I think that is such a prominent part of our government that kind of gets lost on a lot of people, because currently we have not amended the Constitution, I think, since like the 90s, and we consistently are passing laws and provisions that really are unconstitutional. And it's kind of lost on everybody because we haven't had a Supreme Court that stood for it or taken cases. So the only authority given is regulation of times, places, and manner, Hamilton asserts. The qualifications of the persons who can be chosen has been described in earlier papers, and this is unalterable by the legislature alone. They show no significations that it is exclusive to the wealthy themselves. So Hamilton states that if the wealthy were to take power just for argument's sake, he's saying, oh, well, let's say this was the case. So he goes on, he states, and I quote, let it, however, be admitted for argument's sake that the expedient suggested might be successful, and let it at the same time be equally taken for granted that all the scruples which a sense of duty or an apprehension of the danger of the experiment might inspire were overcome in the breasts of the national rulers, still I imagine it will hardly be pretended that they could ever hope to carry such an enterprise into execution without the aid of a military force sufficient to subdue the resistance of the great body of the people. The improbability of the existence of a force equal to that object has been discussed and demonstrated in different parts of these papers." End quote. So this is the part where he really reserves the right and the power is truly in the hands of the people. If they really want to go for a full-on authoritarian push from the federal government and Congress saying who can vote and who can run in these federal elections, what the standards and the qualifications are, he said the people themselves will not allow it to happen because the people will take up arms against the government. That's what he's referring to specifically, because to execute a plan like this and without the aid of a military force sufficient to subdue the resistance of the great body of the people. And additionally, you also have to remember that the military forces, in a general sense, they are of the people themselves. So you're going to have a lot of people that just leave the military, and they just won't fight on that side of authoritarianism. And that's kind of what a good thing is about America as well, is that we live in this industrious, capitalist-like age where you're almost better off living as a free citizen than you are as a soldier or somebody in the military. Whereas years ago, in ancient Rome, when you were in their military, you were a soldier, you were a warrior, you actually lived a better life. You had certain perks that were given to you. You had more food, and you could be able to support your family better. Whereas in America, it's generally the same, if not better, as a private citizen than it is actually being in the military. And that's kind of what helps to keep people much more loyal, people in the military loyal to the people themselves, is because they know it's better on that side anyway. At the end of the day, they go, okay, well, we can follow this ruler into authoritarian rule. What's going to happen? Is my life going to get any better? Is there going to... No, generally it just stays the same. It may get worse, actually. So there's nothing that is incentivizing you to fight for that ruler. So in other words, if the wealthy hypothetically were to take power, why wouldn't they wouldn't have the sufficient resources to invade upon the rights of the people, and the existence of futility in their short rule will quickly be evident. So he ends, or I don't know if he ends because I have a big one, violated majesty. No, he ends. This is what he states, and I quote, "Would they not fear that citizens not less tenacious than conscious of their rights would flock from the remote extremes of their respective states to the places of election to overthrow their tyrants and to substitute men who would be disposed to avenge the violated majesty of the people?" End quote. So that's pretty visceral. That's a visceral reaction. Like when I go back and I quote, I say to people just in a general sense, and I'll be like, man, the founders, the framers of the Constitution, when they talk about Second Amendment, they talk about overthrowing their government. And they'll just go, oh, what are you talking about? They think you're crazy when you say things like that. And then it is directly in the paper, unequivocally, irrefutably right there, where they talk, if the government becomes tyrannical, uses the word tyrants, then the people themselves, with their own, conscious of their own rights, will overthrow their tyrants. I think it's so funny how unaware the population is of some of these founding documents and some of these, the framers' philosophies. So that's going to conclude this one. I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. As always, please make sure you check out the last current event, and as well as the weekend special that's going to be upcoming. Please drop the mic, like, share, subscribe, all of that. I appreciate it, and I will see you this weekend. Thank you.